All right, video friends, you are going to take this paper and you are going to pick 3 explorers that you want to travel with. You're hoping that your explorers will, 1, get you riches, and number 2, get you home. So pick any 3, but if you pick Magellan, you need to pick which of his 5 ships you're going to go on. So 3 total explorers. If you pick Magellan, pick one of those ships. You don't have to pick Magellan, but if you do. So that's this first step. All right. I need one of these 2. Are we picked? Are we still picking? Everybody done? Everybody's picked? Okay. All right, so you read a little bit about exploration in the reading this past week. If you did the reading, people have wanted to explore. Human beings just want to explore. It just seems to be part of who we are, whether it's all the way back from the dawn of time when the ancient civilizations were exploring the earth via the sea. And if we even go back to wherever the Garden of Eden was located, the people from there moved out around the world. And then, of course, at the time of the Tower of Babel, when all the languages were mixed up, people moved out away from there to go to new places, really far away places, we know that. And so explorers have happened all through history, all the way up until now, where we're talking about, maybe we can send a person to Mars and explore Mars in person, not just with a little robot, which we've already done that. So, it might be that your religious beliefs would send you out like a missionary to explore, that you want to conquer new people, new places, and get their wealth and their work. You just want wealth generally, new trade routes, find gold, find whatever riches like silk in China or spices from India. So the age of exploration begins around 1400. Oh yeah, we're gonna take some notes. Exploration begins around the year 1400. This is the age of exploration. And we're talking about European exploration specifically. Because like I said, people have been exploring for a very long time. Written records, we know all the way back to the Phoenicians that people were exploring. We know that people ended up as far away as Polynesia, out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean where there's nothing. So people have traveled everywhere on our planet. 1400? What? Yeah. Did I not write it? Oh. It's so busy talking about other things. Thank you, Carter, and kicking the easel every single week. Wouldn't be history class if I didn't kick the easel a couple of times. All right, so there begins to be hostility between Christians and Muslims. And the trade routes to the east, to China and India, are cut off by the wars with the Muslims. Okay, so the trade routes are cut off. This pen is dying because of Christian-Muslim wars. Many of these Muslims were Turks, by the way, living in what is now Turkey, the country of Turkey. I should say Turks. That's not an X, that's a K. Can you tell that? Sort of. Okay. So because of that, now they can't get to China, and they can't get to India. They can't get the spices they want from India. They can't get the silk they want from China. And so they begin to head out in ships, okay? Like I said, we talked about the Phoenicians who traveled in for exploration, and Marco Polo long ago, and the Norsemen, the Vikings, who came from the north, and also went to the North American continent. We actually know that Leif Erikson established a colony called Vinland in the North American continent. It didn't last very long, but there is archaeological evidence that that colony was there. So people have been doing this for a long time, but now we have advances in technology. We have new things for navigation. We have things like the compass. This is technology. We have things called the astrolabe, which allows you to look at the night sky and calculate your location. And we have the chronometer, which is a timepiece, timekeeper, which helps you keep track of how far you've gone. At this point in navigation, they know about latitude. They can tell by the North Star how north or far south they are. That's what latitude tells you. They do not yet know about longitude. Longitude tells you how far east or west you are, and they do not have a way of measuring that yet. But we do have in better sailing ships that can go further. There's some understanding of what men need if they're going to travel long distances to keep food from spoiling or being eaten by rats. As long as there have been ships, there have been rats on ships. So they discovered that salted food would keep longer, and they would make what was called hardtack, which was a very dry, hard, biscuity kind of bread that, because it was so dry, would last for a long time. It wouldn't get moldy. So they kept those things. The one thing that they learned about over time was the need for vitamin C in your diet. They didn't know that, and the condition you get, anybody know what happens if you don't have enough vitamin C? Scurvy. You get a life-threatening condition called scurvy. So no vitamin C means scurvy, and scurvy can do all kinds of terrible things to your body, and eventually it will kill you. Okay. And so some sailors died because they did not have fresh fruits and vegetables to eat. So it's things that they learn kind of by trial and error. They figure these things out. But as they learn these things, they're able to travel further than they have before. It was actually the Portuguese who were the best navigators originally. There was a Portuguese captain named Henry the Navigator. And Henry the Navigator was one of their first great explorers. He actually would gather other navigators from around Europe. He kind of had what we would call it a think tank, where you gather all the experts together to learn about what do you know, what do I know. He also sponsored a number of expeditions, sailing expeditions, down the west coast of Africa. Staying within sight of land all the time so they wouldn't get lost out in the ocean. Remember, they don't know how to figure out how far east or west they are yet. They don't have that skill because you need a clock to do that. And actually, to have a clock on a ship at this point, the technology was not available. And one of the reasons they did that is because there was a legend that there was a Christian king in Africa named Prester John. And so they went looking for him in hope that he would come and help them overthrow the Muslims and bring Christianity back to some of the parts of Africa that have become Muslims. So the explorer's life, they didn't sail out into the unknown without some idea of where they were going. We're at a point where we know enough about the world that they had an idea about where they were going. They might have been searching for a specific land or a specific route. But sometimes they got surprised along the way because the information wasn't complete. Usually the captain of the ship would have a rich benefactor, either a king or a wealthy man or a government official who had the money to pay for the supplying the ship. Usually the captains owned the ship. Not always, but many times the captain owned the ship, but they needed supplies and they needed men to sail with them. And so they would get money from somebody important and rich, and then the crewmen would sign on to go on these voyages. And these were long, dangerous voyages, and everybody knew that going in. So a lot of times you didn't get like the top-notch sailors, right? You got the sailors who just really needed a job. And so they, or maybe might even want to be leaving wherever they are for some reason, whatever that reason might be. Why did captains do it? Well, it was wealth, political favor from a king or a queen. They might be a merchant or an adventurer seeking something like that. They could be a soldier. They could be a gentleman of the court headed off. I mean, that's really who sailed to Jamestown. They were gentlemen sailing to the New World, which of course wasn't new to the people already living there, but that's what they called it. All right, and even the captain wasn't always that experienced at long distance travel. They may have only done, you know, shipping in areas that were already known. So usually he would have a pilot or a first mate. Those are kind of the same thing, who were in charge of navigation. They were usually the most experienced person on the ship because they knew something about navigation. And the crew, of course, would work the sails and the rigging and the ropes. All of those things. They would make repairs if necessary. And they really didn't cook much. A lot of times you'll see these movies where, you know, the ship has a cook that is making food for people, but they didn't really do a lot of cooking. Most of their food was preserved and was eaten cold. And obviously they had to bring their own water as well, so they'd have barrels and barrels of fresh water because you can't drink seawater. Why can't you drink seawater? Well, because you will die. And if it's actually their, you okay, Carter? Falling asleep over there? No. So they would have water so that, like I said, once you get so thirsty you drink salt water, it just makes you thirstier, and then eventually it kills you. So never drink salt water. Actually, if you're ever stranded somewhere and all there is salt water, the best thing to drink is your own pee. So, just so you know. Just stay hydrated. You put the water back in your body that you just got rid of, right? So they'd have pickled foods and dried foods. Like I said, biscuits that would be really hard, made with little water so they wouldn't get moldy. What they would always get were little tiny black insects called weevils. There would always be weevils in anything made with flour and, you know, just a little extra protein, I guess. You know, as you didn't have much choice but to eat the bugs right along with the biscuits. And they would carry cheese and onions, beans, salted fish. They would usually try to catch fish along the way to have fresh food. And they learned ultimately they needed fresh fruits and vegetables so that the sailors didn't die of scurvy. And the problem is, you know, they had to have water. They had to have liquid. And fresh water didn't always stay very pleasant in these barrels on the ships. They would also carry barrels of wine, although wine will often go sour when it's not kept at a constant temperature. So that was always an issue. And so whenever a ship spotted land, they would always go ashore, and the first thing they'd look for would be water. Water was the hardest thing to get. So the Portuguese, like I said, were the first to actually go out into the Atlantic, out of sight of land. And Spain followed close behind. So the Portuguese and the Spanish are kind of in a race across the Atlantic over, not like an actual race, but like over time, who would get what, who would get where, who would take the spoils. So we have the Portuguese and the Spanish. And the Spanish, they build a new world empire that makes Spain the most powerful country in Europe for a long time, mostly based on their conquering of Central and South America. They got a lot of gold. The Aztecs had a lot of gold, and the Inca had gold. Unfortunately for the English, nobody in North America had gold yet, so the English didn't get wealth that way. And then the Portuguese, of course, landed in Brazil, and they didn't get that much wealth in Brazil, but they did get a lot of slaves in Brazil. They brought a lot of natives home with them to sell as slaves, another way to get riches back in the day. And of course, anybody know what the native language of Brazil is? Portuguese, and that's why. It's because the Portuguese found it first. And so they've always spoken Portuguese there. It's why in Central and South and the rest of South America and Central America they speak Spanish, because the Spanish got there first, and it's why we speak English, because the English got there first. And in the eastern half of Canada, a little part of Canada now, it used to be more of Canada. Who knows what they speak there? Eastern Canada, especially in the state of Quebec. That's the only place that's left still speaking French, because the French traders, the French came for furs. They got rich on furs by trapping animals and bringing the furs home, and they were French trappers. And so in the state of Quebec in Canada, or the province, they don't call it a state, they call it a province of Quebec, they still speak French. And many people are bilingual, English and French, in Canada, the way there are people in America, especially in areas where there's a large Latino population where people are bilingual, English and Spanish. So the Portuguese were the bravest. They went out first, outside of land, headed across the ocean, hoping to find something along their way. And they did. They found the continent of South America, as did the Spanish. So we go from the beginning of the 15th century, the 1400s, and we have all these sea-going vessels going little by little. So let's talk about our specific explorers and see what happened based on whose ship you decided to travel on. The first one is Bartolomeo Dias, who is Portuguese. He's the guy that sailed down the coast of Africa looking for Prester John. And he encounters winds that blow them off course for a couple of weeks, but they finally are able to get back to where they want to be. But they go so far south that they end up sailing around the southern tip of Africa, of the continent, which is called the Cape of Good Hope now. And when they find land again, it's on the wrong side of the ship. It's on the west side of the ship where they're not expecting it to be. They're still looking for land on the right, not realizing they've already gone around the tip of Africa. And so they sight land on the west, realizing they're on the opposite coast. They battle with the natives, who are called Hottentots. I don't know if you can see this, Carter. It's Hottentots, who are natives. They named them the Hottentots. I don't think they were called themselves that. But they make it home. So if you sailed with Dias, you return home after a year and a half, and you live. Not a bad deal compared to some of the people, some of the things that happen. So if you chose Vasco da Gama, he was also Portuguese, sent out to India with 3 ships and 170 men. So we have Vasco da Gama. I'm just going to put da Gama because that's his last name. And you're headed for India. What were they looking for in India? Spices, right, because spices were more valuable than gold at this time of history. And so you end up fighting Muslims in India. 2/3 of your men die of scurvy. But you do manage to fill the hold of your ship with spices, and you return home rich. And the Portuguese become a major power in India, tremendous wealth based on the spice trade. one shipload of spices paid for every Portuguese voyage 10 times over. So they made a 10 times profit on every investment in a ship going to India. So if you chose Vasco da Gama, you are very rich. Unless you died of scurvy, but we're gonna assume you're one of the survivors. I'm gonna give you some help here, okay? All right, Alfonso de Albuquerque sets out to explore and conquer India, the Muslims in India. He is very successful, and they make him the governor of India. He is very cruel ruler over, yes. Oh, he's not on there. Okay. He is not on there, so nobody picked him, so never mind. But he is a very cruel ruler over the local Muslims, but he becomes extremely wealthy in the spice trade. And if he had been on your sheet and you had chosen him, you would be rich. All right. You've probably heard of the various names of Cristoforo Colon or Cristobal Colon, or as we call him in America, Christopher Columbus. He was Italian, but he sailed for the Portuguese. He learned from the Portuguese. He learned all his navigational skills from Portuguese mariners, but he could not convince the Portuguese to listen to his plan of sailing west to China, because China's east of Europe. Right, but he believed because he believed the world was about 2/3 smaller than it actually is. He wasn't very good at calculating the size of the earth, but he did know that the earth was not flat. And a lot of people knew that the earth was not flat, because when you sail a ship, it doesn't just get smaller and smaller and smaller until it disappears and you can't see it anymore. It actually drops down and disappears below the horizon from bottom to top. So he knew there was a curve, that the ships were doing this, right? And so he knew that you wouldn't fall off the edge. And a lot of scientific, educated people knew that you wouldn't fall off the edge. Not all the sailors knew it. Sometimes the sailors were a little hesitant to sail out into the open ocean, because what if it was just a disc and you fell off into space? I don't know what that would mean, but of course it isn't true. And so, but the Portuguese were not interested. This is in 1484 that he is trying to get the Portuguese to believe him and pay for him to sail west to China, or as they called it at the time, Cathay. And there's actually still a Cathay Airlines that you can fly to China, named after this old name of China. And so he goes around Europe trying to convince other European monarchs to pay for his voyage. I know you probably all know this story already. And nobody really wanted to, until finally the Spanish, Ferdinand and Isabella, they said, all right, we're going to do it. We're going to pay for it. And so he sailed west in what year? 1492. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and his crew at the time when they got on that ship and signed on didn't know that they would be sailing directly out into the ocean. He took 3 ships with him. You know the name of his ships? The Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, exactly. The Santa Maria would later sink. So hopefully if you went with Columbus, you weren't on the Santa Maria. And Columbus is actually a very devout Christian man, and he writes about in his things how he felt compelled by God to go on this voyage. And he arrives somewhere in the Caribbean. We don't know exactly where. There's no archaeology to tell us exactly where. It might have been the island of Hispaniola, which is where Haiti and the Dominican Republic are today. It might have been in the Bahamas. There's disputes among scholars about exactly where he went. He makes 2 more voyages after the first one. He didn't just take 1 voyage. He took 3 actually. And he keeps ending up in the Caribbean, on islands in the Caribbean. And in his 4th voyage, he actually makes it to Central America. He didn't make it to India, obviously, but what he did do was discover there was a very giant landmass between Europe and China. Like, that was unknown before India and China. That was unknown before that. And so he became the first European to lay claim to this whole new 2 giant continents. They're really one continent because they're connected, but then we disconnected them when we built the Panama Canal. But they're basically all one land mass, and there was no way across until, other than to get out of your ship, to drag your ship across the Isthmus of Panama. It's a hard word to say if you have trouble with S's. And get back in the water on the other side. So it's the Nina that is the one that actually makes landfall. It was not a new world. There were already indigenous people, many indigenous people living there. All of the American native tribes, along with all of the South American and Central American tribes, the Aztecs, the Incas, the Maya, all already living there. It was not a new world, only to the Europeans. So nobody gets rich going with Columbus, but they do get the glory. So if you decide to go with Columbus, you have the glory of having discovered a whole new land that nobody knew about before. All right, Martin Alonso Pinzon was Spanish, and he was the captain of the Pinta under Columbus. And he left Columbus to go out on his own, and he tried to race Columbus home to get the glory, but he was too late, and Columbus got the glory and the credit. So if you're with Pinzon, you get no riches and no glory, but you do survive to make it home. So that's kind of the
Bright side.
the bright side. I was trying to think of the consolation prize that you get when you don't win. Okay, so Balboa, Vasco Nunez de Balboa, was a Spanish guy. Surprising with that name. Not really. Who settled on the island of Hispaniola, which I mentioned before. That's where currently the Dominican Republic and Haiti split that island, the two countries on the same island. And actually he settled the first European settlement from Europe, not counting the Norse people because they didn't stay for very long. They went back home or they died off, we're not sure. But he did have the first permanent European settlement on the mainland of South America. He crossed the Isthmus of Panama to the Pacific Ocean. Thus, he was the first European to see that side of the Pacific Ocean. And the expedition, unfortunately, had a lot of problems with disease, a lot of problems from Indians, from native people. And so he returns and discovers that the people who had sent him out on his journey have been overthrown, and there is a brand new political situation with his enemies now in charge. And when he gets back, he's beheaded. So not so good for Balboa. So if you went with him, you suffered, and you don't get any glory, and you don't get any riches, but you do get to see the Pacific Ocean, which pretty much nobody else in Europe has done that. So, okay, Cabral. Cabral is Portuguese, and he accidentally discovers Brazil when he's blown west across the Atlantic. And so Brazil is claimed by Portugal. He heads back across the Atlantic. He goes around the southern tip of Africa and heads to India and brings home a cargo of spices. So if you chose Cabral, you have riches and glory. You win. All right. All right, Magellan. If you chose one of Magellan's ships, Magellan is another Portuguese guy. He had actually been a soldier. He was injured in military service and walked with a limp for his whole life. And he believed that the Pacific Ocean was actually much smaller than anyone else said it was, and that you could sail around the world to Asia by sailing west. The Portuguese king is like, no way, I don't want to have anything to do with that. So he went to the Spanish, and Charles V, the king, he agreed to bankroll this expedition. And so Magellan set sail from the Spanish city of Seville on August in 1519 with 5 ships and a crew of 230 men. So he's got a lot of people. So, like I said, you had to choose one of those 5 ships if you chose one. So here is what happened to those 5 ships. The first ship returned to Seville. It never went anywhere. Went out in the ocean, had a problem, turned around and went back. So if you were on ship number 1, you basically just went home. And the second ship ran aground and you drowned. So that was not a good ship to be on. The third ship was captured in the Philippines, burned, and your captain was murdered. Magellan was killed. I know. His first mate, whose name was Elcano, continued on with the last 2 ships. The fourth ship was captured by the Portuguese and taken away. The fifth ship returned to Seville, back to Spain, with 31 crewmen who were the first people to ever sail around the world. They also brought back a cargo hold full of spices that was sold for enough money to pay for the entire voyage of all 5 ships. So if you chose ship 5, you win. You're rich, you have glory, and you've sailed all the way around the world. Yes?
So did ship number 3 die?
Ship number 3, yes, it was captured in the Philippines and burned to the ground, and Magellan was killed, and probably either you were taken captive and were a slave, or you were killed as well.
So it seems like the Spanish are very gullible.
So yeah, I know they keep wanting to say, they keep sending ships out, hoping for the best, right?
They're making drowning look a lot better than that.
But like I said, if you're on ship 5, you got it all. Okay, Ponce de Leon explored, well, he was Spanish, and he explored Florida for one specific thing, which was the Fountain of Youth. That's what he was looking for, this mythical, you drink the water and you'll be young forever. And this article that I pulled all this from, what they wrote is, if you went with Ponce de Leon, that he was a few centuries early, he should have just waited for Disney World. That's what they put on here. But unfortunately, at that point, all he found in Florida was mosquitoes, alligators, murderous native people, and disease. He dies of an arrow wound, and pretty much if you went with Ponce de Leon, you did not return. You died in the, quote, New World. Okay, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo was Portuguese, sailing for Spain. Again, he explored the Gulf of California. Unfortunately, I should have brought a map. But if you know what the west coast of the United States and Mexico looks like, it's like you have the west coast, right? And then, so like here's Washington, right? Here's Oregon. Here's California. Oops, wrong side. Here's California. And down here, all this down here is Mexico. Okay, but there's a little piece of land right here that's like that. And this right here is the Gulf of California, in Baja, as they call it, or Lower Mexico. All right, so it's Mexico, and then this is the Bay of California. And so, where was I? Okay, he explored the Gulf of California and discovered that Baja, this little piece of land, which everyone thought was an island, and he discovered it was actually connected to the mainland. So it's actually, anybody know what that's called? That island, that feature, that land feature? Nope, it's a peninsula. So that's a peninsula. Virginia has a peninsula, right? So we talked about people who live on the peninsula of Virginia. So he discovered that, so he made that discovery. But unfortunately, he dies after an Indian attack or a native attack, and his crew returns home without him. So if you picked him, you don't get rich, but you do come home with some excellent maps. So you get the glory for that. So okay, and then who's next? Juan Diaz de Solis, Spanish, sailed to the southeastern part of South America. They spot locals on the beach as they were sailing past, and so they decide to land and go ashore and meet the natives, and the natives throw a feast for them, but unfortunately they are the main course at the feast. So if you chose Solis, basically you are lunch, literally. And Coronado was a Spanish explorer and conquistador. He sailed around the American Southwest, like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, that area, looking specifically for these mythical 7 cities of gold. Supposedly there were 7 cities that were full of gold and riches, and if you could find them and conquer them, you would have all that gold and riches. Unfortunately, what he found was a lot of bison and a big hole in the ground. He is actually the first European to discover the Grand Canyon. And but no cities of gold because, you know, Las Vegas isn't around yet. And so, sorry, no gold for you, but you do return home safely. So there's that. Panfilo de Narvaez was Spanish. He was an explorer and a soldier. He helped conquer Cuba of its natives in 1511, and he led an expedition to Florida. They survived a hurricane in Cuba, and they landed on the west coast of Florida, but all they found there was mosquitoes and alligators and hostile natives, diseases, and another hurricane. So they actually went through 2 hurricanes on this voyage. They were stranded, so they made rafts, hoping to go out across the Gulf of Mexico and reach the Spanish in Mexico City, but 2 of the rafts sank, and one of the rafts managed to land in Texas but was attacked by natives. So if you went with Narvaez, you did not survive. Where's my next page? Still got some time. Yeah, my pages are mixed up. Ah, here we go. Where are we? I'm looking for Cabeza de Vaca. Cabeza de Vaca's name means head of a cow. That's what it means. I don't know why that's his name, but it is. And I can't find the page that he's on. Did anybody choose him? Yes. Okay, so I have to find out. Oh, there it is. Okay. So he was part of Narvaez's crew, and he is captured by Indians in Texas along with some of the other ones. But they think he's a medicine man, that he is a shaman or a priest. So they release him, and he meets some more survivors, and they don't have a lot of food, but they decide they're going to walk to Mexico. And so they're the first non-native, first Europeans basically, to travel the southwestern part of North America. Only 4 men survive, and it takes them 8 years to walk to Mexico City. So maybe you survived and ended up in Mexico City. Maybe you didn't. It's hard to say. All right, let's see. Who's there? Okay, de Teixeira. Pedro de Teixeira is Portuguese and explores most of the Amazon. The first Europeans to travel large sections of the Amazon River. They claim it for Portugal. He actually has troops with him. He kicks out the English and the Dutch and the French while he is there, and he explores Brazil all the way from the Amazon to the Andes Mountains. So you get a lot of glory if you went with Teixeira, because he learns a lot and he gets a lot of excitement over that when he gets back to Portugal. Tavares de Tavares was another Portuguese, and they go 7,000 miles marching around Brazil, establishing the Portuguese claim on Brazil and basically cementing it as a Portuguese colony. So they get riches and they also get rewards from the Portuguese monarchy. Let's see who's next. Cortez. Cortez is a pretty famous guy because he, with his little army, conquers the richest empire in South America. The Aztecs mistake him for their god, Quetzalcoatl, and he captures their emperor, Montezuma. So you are rich, 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 and have a lot of glory if you went with Cortez. The one thing they did bring back to Europe with them besides Aztec gold was what is sometimes referred to as Montezuma's revenge, which is a very bad case of dysentery, which means you have lots of diarrhea for a long time. So these are, they're encountering new diseases and new germs and things that they haven't ever encountered in Europe, and they bring them home with them. So as many natives died from European diseases that they had not ever encountered. Europeans died of natives. Okay, we got one more. Anybody know what Amerigo Vespucci is known for? America. Our country is named after him. He is Italian. He made 4 voyages to America as strictly as a businessman, not as an explorer. Y'all, I have 10 minutes. Why are you putting stuff away? And I don't know, of course I lost my place. He actually sailed twice for Spain and twice for Portugal. He met Columbus on his 2nd voyage. Some historians say he stole Columbus's glory and that he named America after himself, which it should have probably named Columbia, not America. But what he really did, that's not really true. What he really did was publish a book about his voyages and stating that the lands to the west were not China and they were not India, but they were a new world. He's the first one to use that expression in his book. And this guy, who is a German map maker, a cartographer, that's what a map maker is called, read this book. And so when he made his first map of the new continent, he labeled it the New World of Amerigo. Thus, it became the New World of America. So, so while Columbus discovered the New World for Europe, it was Vespucci who recognized that this was a whole new place. This was not India. This was not China. This was a whole new continent. He's the one who first wrote it down and said, this is what happened. So things change in Europe based on all of this. New wealth flows into many parts because they do discover gold in Central and South America and other precious metals. New crops come in. People's diets begin to change with the New World food. And next week we'll talk about what foods are Old World and what foods are New World. But we're not going to talk about that today. What?
Corn is a New World food.
That is correct. You are correct.
Yeah.
That is one of the main New World foods that was brought back to Europe, New World crops. So religious communities who want to bring the faith of Christianity, they come over to the New World. You know when I say New World, what I'm talking about, right? It wasn't new, but that's what they referred to it as. And so there's more exploration and more settlement happening. The era, remember those 3 Gs? Do you remember what those 3 Gs were? God, glory, and gold. Exactly. Wiped out the indigenous people that they encountered either by battle or by disease, new diseases, smallpox, chickenpox. People died of chickenpox and measles and all these European diseases because they had no immunity whatsoever. So if we look at all of this European exploration from the viewpoint of the indigenous people of the Americas, it was a disaster. It was like a Holocaust for them. So there are so few indigenous people left, and there are more indigenous people in South America, but they are almost all mixed race now, what they call mestizos, because they intermarried with Spanish people. So there are very few actual indigenous people from either North or South America that survive to this day. There are a few, not a lot. And America hasn't been good to them either, the country of America, when it became a country. What we did to the native people here, all the promises we made to them that were never kept, and taking all of their land and never giving them recompense for it. We committed a lot of crimes in America, mostly because that era, if you weren't white and European, you were considered not fully human by many people, which is what was part of the justification for having African slaves, part of the justification for not keeping the promises that we made to these indigenous people, because they're a brown-skinned people, they're not white, they're not European, they are inferior to us, right? We know that's false. We know that people are people, we're all God's children, we're all his creation, but that mindset was very strong among Europeans in that era, and so they just saw them as inferior people that they didn't really need to take care of. So a lot of spices and silk and gold were brought back from Asia. And, we know Christopher Columbus showed people you can sail across the ocean and you don't fall off the edge of the earth. Although a lot of people knew that. He proved it. So you mentioned corn, okay? Another example is potatoes. Potatoes are from Peru originally. That's where Pizarro first saw them. And they changed the life of Europe because a potato has half the nourishment you need in a day. It has enough vitamin C to prevent you from getting scurvy. So you could survive on potatoes and prevent scurvy on board ship. If you catch some fish, you have protein and you're good to go. If you have protein in ship and fish and fresh water, you can survive on a long voyage. Yes?
So you can live off of French fries and fish?
I think when you expose them to high temperatures, they lose their vitamin C.
Oh, man.
So you can't fry them.
Dang it.
Sorry, you can bake them, but you can have baked potatoes and baked potatoes and fish. You would be fine.
Dang. I only like French fries. I don't like potatoes at all.
Well,
but
then
whenever
that's
I-
no help for you. But if you were on a ship in the middle of the ocean and you were hungry, you'd probably like a potato.
I would.
But it's funny because half the world's potatoes now, and even back then it started happening, are fed to livestock. And because potatoes are cheap to grow and fast to grow, it keeps meat prices low. So potatoes were kind of a miracle plant. You can plant them easily, you can grow them quickly, you can eat them within 2 months or 3 months, no, 2 months after planting them. And of course, corn, which you mentioned, is the other miracle crop that came from the New World. All right, I'll let you out 5 minutes early. Good job.